Hello there. Welcome to Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. In this video, we shall talk about earthquakes, which is a geological disaster. This video will also be useful for you for your paper on essay writing. In the next video, we shall talk about the National Disaster Management Guidelines on Earthquakes issued by the government in April 2007. So do look out for that too. I do hope that you have seen my earlier videos where we have studied the concepts of disaster and disaster management and the shift in governmental policies regarding disaster management. So, the first and most obvious question in our minds is as to what is an earthquake? Well, an earthquake is a sudden trembling or shaking movement of the Earth's surface called the crust, resulting from the sudden release of energy in the crust and creating seismic waves. Movements within the Earth's crust cause stress to build up at points of weakness and rocks to deform. Stored energy builds up in the same way as energy builds up in the spring of a watch when it is wound. When the stress finally exceeds the strength of the rock fractures along a fault, often at a zone of existing weakness within the rock. Intense vibrations or seismic waves spread out from the initial point of rupture, the focus, like ripples on a pond. These waves are what makes the ground shake and can travel large distances in all directions. Near the focus, the waves can be very large, making them extremely destructive. In other words, an earthquake is what happens when two blocks of the earth suddenly slip past one another. The surface where they slip is called the fault or fault plane. The location below the Earth's surface where the earthquake starts is called the hypocenter, and the location directly above it on the surface of the Earth is called the epicenter. If we look at the pattern of where earthquakes occur around the world, it is clear that most of the earthquake activity is concentrated in a number of distinct earthquake belts. For instance, there are many earthquakes recorded around the edge of the Pacific Ocean or in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Our second question then is, how are earthquakes recorded? The size of an earthquake depends on the size of the fault and the amount of slip on the fault. But that's not something scientists can simply measure with a measuring tape, since faults are many kilometers deep beneath the Earth's surface. Earthquakes are thus recorded by instruments called seismographs. The recording they make is called a seismogram. How does this work? Well, the seismograph has a base that sets firmly in the ground and a heavy weight that hangs free. When an earthquake causes the ground to shake, the base of the seismograph shakes too, but the hanging weight does not. Instead, the spring or string that it is hanging from absorbs all the movement. The difference in position between the shaking part of the seismograph and the motionless part is what is recorded. Scientists then use a method called triangulation to determine exactly where the earthquake was. It is called triangulation because a triangle has three sides and it takes three seismographs to locate an earthquake. The size of an earthquake is called its magnitude. There is one magnitude for each earthquake. Scientists also talk about the intensity of shaking from an earthquake, and this varies depending on where you are during the earthquake. Now, our third question is, what are the scales to measure the size of the earthquake? Well, we have a number of such scales available to us. Let's take a brief view of them. Although similar seismographs had existed since the 1890s, it was only in 1935 that Charles F. Richter, a seismologist at the California Institute of Technology, introduced the concept of earthquake magnitude. The earliest such scale is thus called the Richter scale. The Richter scale is logarithmic. That means that the amplitude of a magnitude 6 earthquake is 10 times greater than a magnitude 5 earthquake. In the Richter scale, earthquakes of a magnitude less than 3.5 are generally not felt but recorded. Magnitude 3.5 to 5.4 are often felt but rarely causes damage. Earthquakes of magnitude under 6 at most cause slight damage to well-designed buildings over small regions, while magnitude 6.1 to 6.9 can be destructive in areas up to 100 kilometers across where people live. Finally, earthquakes of magnitude 7 to 7.9 are classified as major earthquakes as they can cause serious damage over larger areas. And of course, magnitude 8 or greater are the great earthquakes, causing serious damage in areas several hundred kilometers across. On the Richter scale, magnitude is expressed in whole numbers and decimal fractions. For example, a magnitude 5.3 might be computed for a moderate earthquake, and a strong earthquake might be rated as magnitude 6.3. Each whole number step in the magnitude scale corresponds to the release of about 31 times more energy than the amount associated with the preceding whole number value. The Richter scale, however, does not provide accurate estimates for large magnitude earthquakes, since the scale was specific to California earthquakes. It is not commonly used anymore, except for small earthquakes recorded locally. For all other earthquakes, the moment magnitude scale is a more accurate measure of the earthquake size. Other scales based on wave amplitudes and total earthquake duration have also been developed for use in other situations consistent with Richter's scale. So now we go on to the moment magnitude scale. I know you will now jump up and say, but the media always refers to an earthquake in the Richter scale? Well, like almost everything else, the media has it wrong. The moment magnitude scale is now preferred because it works over a wider range of earthquake sizes and is applicable globally. This scale is based on the total moment release of the earthquake. What is a moment? Moment is a product of the distance a fault moved and the force required to move it. It is derived from modeling recordings of the earthquake at multiple stations. Moment magnitude estimates are about the same as the Richter magnitudes for small to large earthquakes. But only the moment magnitude scale is capable of measuring magnitude 8 and greater events accurately. The moment magnitude scale is thus preferred because it works over a wider range of earthquake sizes and is applicable globally. Magnitude scales can be used to describe earthquakes so small that they are expressed in negative numbers. The scale also has no upper limit, so it can describe earthquakes of unimaginable and, so far, unexperienced intensity, such as magnitude 10 and beyond. Another way to measure the strength of an earthquake is to use the Mercalli scale. Invented by Giuseppe Mercalli in 1902, this scale uses the observations of the people who experienced the earthquake to estimate its intensity. It measures the intensity and effects of an earthquake and is distinct from the moment magnitude usually reported for an earthquake, which is a measure of the energy released. Some things that affect the amount of damage that occurs are the building designs, the distance from the epicenter, and the type of surface material, rock or dirt, the buildings rest on. Different building designs hold up differently in an earthquake. And the further you are from the earthquake, the less damage you'll usually see. Whether a building is built on solid rock or sand makes a big difference in how much damage it takes. Solid rock usually shakes less than sand, so building built on top of solid rock should be as damaged as it might if it were sitting on a sandy lot. The fourth scale is the modified Mercalli intensity scale. The effect of an earthquake on the Earth's surface is called the intensity. The intensity scale consists of a series of certain key responses such as people awakening, movement of furniture, damage to chimneys, and finally, total destruction. The lower numbers of the intensity scale generally deal with the manner in which the earthquake is felt by people. The higher numbers of the scale are based on observed structural damage. This scale is the one currently used in the United States. Now all that is clear. We would definitely like to know as to what are earthquake hazards. Having seen the causes and measuring scales of earthquakes, let us discuss the earthquake hazards. Earthquakes really pose little direct danger to a person. People can't be shaken to death by an earthquake. Some movies show scenes with the ground suddenly opening up and people falling into fiery pits, but this just doesn't happen in real life. Most of the hazards to people come from man-made structures themselves and the shaking they receive from the earthquake. The real dangers to people are being crushed in a collapsing building, drowning in a flood caused by a broken dam or embankment, getting buried under a landslide, or being burned in a fire. Let us now study these hazards. The first hazard is the effect of ground shaking. Buildings can be damaged by the shaking itself or by the ground beneath them settling to a different level than it was before the earthquake. Buildings can even sink into the ground if soil liquefaction occurs. Liquefaction is the mixing of sand or soil and groundwater during the shaking of a moderate or strong earthquake. When the water and soil are mixed, the ground becomes very soft and acts similar to quicksand. Buildings can also be damaged by strong surface waves, making the ground heave and lurch. Any buildings in the path of these surface waves can lean or tip over from all the movement. The ground shaking may also cause landslides, mudslides, and avalanches on steeper hills or mountains, all of which can damage buildings and hurt people. The second earthquake hazard is the effect of ground displacement or ground movement along a fault. If a structure, a building, road, etc., is built across a fault, the ground displacement during an earthquake could seriously damage or rip apart that structure. The third main hazard is flooding. An earthquake can rupture, that is, break dams or embankments along a river. The water from the river or the reservoir would then flood the area, damaging buildings and maybe sweeping away or drowning people. Tsunami and seisures can also cause a great deal of damage. A tsunami is what most people call a tidal wave, but it has nothing to do with the tides on the ocean. It is a huge wave caused by an earthquake under the ocean. Tsunamis can be tens of feet high when they hit the shore and can do enormous damage to the coastline. Seisures are like small tsunamis. They occur on lakes that are shaken by earthquakes and are usually only a few feet high, but they can still flood or knock down houses and tip over trees. The fourth main earthquake hazard is fire. These fires can be started by broken gas lines and power lines, or tipped over wood or coal stoves. They can be a serious problem, especially if the water lines that feed the fire hydrants are broken too. For example, after the Great San Francisco earthquake in 1906, the city burned for 3 days and most of the city was destroyed as the water lines had burst. We now move on to the earthquake zones in India. The Indian subcontinent has a history of devastating earthquakes. The major reason for the high frequency and intensity of the earthquakes is that the Indian plate is driving into Asia at a rate of approximately 47 millimeter per year. Geographical statistics of India show that almost 54% of their land is vulnerable to earthquakes. The biggest quakes occur in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Kutch, Himachal, and the northeast. The Himalayan regions are particularly prone to earthquakes. The Geological Survey of India first published the seismic zoning map of the country in 1935. With numerous modifications made afterwards, this map was initially based on the amount of damage suffered by the different regions of India because of earthquakes. The latest version of seismic zoning map given in the Earthquake Resistant Design Code of India assigns 4 levels of seismicity for India in terms of zone factors. The Earthquake Zoning Map of India divides the country into 4 seismic zones. Zones 2, 3, 4 and 5. Zone 5 expects the highest level of seismicity, whereas Zone 2 is associated with the lowest level of seismicity. Zone 5 covers the areas with the highest risk damage and is referred to as the very high damage risk zone. This region includes the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, all of northeastern India, parts of northwestern Bihar, eastern sections of Uttaranchal, the Kangra Valley in Himachal Pradesh, near the Srinagar area in Jammu and Kashmir, and the Rann of Kutch in Gujarat. Earthquakes with magnitudes in excess of 7 have occurred in these areas. Zone 4 is called the high damage risk zone and covers the Indo-Gangetic Basin and the northern part of Bihar and Nepal. 3 of the 4 of the major metropolitan areas lie in Zone 4, that is New Delhi, Mumbai and Kolkata. Only Chennai lies in Zone 2. Zone 3 includes parts of Kashmir and Western Himalayas. This zone is classified as moderate damage risk zone. Zone 2 is classified as the low damage risk zone. Since the current division of India into earthquake hazard zones does not use Zone 1, no area of India is classed as Zone 1. Further, as part of pre-disaster preparedness measure, the Government of India has also completed seismic microzonation studies of some of the major cities in the country, such as Jabalpur, Guwahati, Bengaluru, Greater Bharuch in Gujarat, Jammu, Shillong, Chennai and Sikkim. So what is the earthquake risk in India? India's high earthquake risk and vulnerability is evident from the fact that about 59% of the land area could face moderate to severe earthquakes. During the period 1990 to 2006, 6 major earthquakes caused enormous damage to property and public infrastructure. The occurrence of several devastating earthquakes in areas hitherto considered safe from earthquakes indicates that the built environment in the country is extremely fragile and our ability to prepare ourselves and effectively respond to earthquakes is inadequate. Very few buildings in India meet the standards in the Indian Standard Criteria for Earthquake Resistant Design, first published by the Bureau of Indian Standards in 1962. The latest revision being in 2005. These are not enforced, so almost no one knows such earthquake resistance standards and guidelines for homeowners even exist. The Delhi Metro is one of the few Indian structures built to withstand a quake. Many of the houses built in Bhuj after the Gujarat quake of 2001 are now earthquake resistant. The rear building and high rise may be designed for quakes, but nothing has changed since 1993, when a relatively mild earthquake of magnitude 6.4 in Maharashtra's Latur district killed nearly 10,000 people in what was till then considered a non-seismic zone. Most died because shoddily constructed houses collapsed at the first major shake, as they did in Gujarat 8 years later. Let us now have a look at the major earthquakes in India. These are a cruel reminder of the natural disasters the country has faced in the past. These disasters have impacted millions of lives in the country and also proved our lack of competence to tackle such tragedies on a large scale. The 1934 Bihar earthquake is considered to be one of the worst earthquakes in Indian history. The quake occurred on January 15, 1934 and was recorded at a magnitude of 8.1. Over 30,000 people were said to have been killed in the disaster. The 1950 Assam earthquake had a magnitude of 8.6 and caused widespread destruction in both Assam and Tibet. Over 1,500 people were killed in Assam alone. It was considered to be among the 10 largest earthquakes of the 20th century. During the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, observed by the United Nations in the 1990s, India witnessed several earthquakes, like the Uttarkashi earthquake of 1991, the Latur earthquake of 1993, the Jabalpur earthquake of 1997, and the Chamoli earthquake of 1999. These were followed by the Bhuj earthquake of 26 January 2001 and the Jammu and Kashmir earthquake of 8 October 2005. So what have we learned from these earthquakes? All these major earthquakes have established that casualties were caused primarily due to the collapse of buildings. However, similar high-intensity earthquakes in the United States and Japan do not lead to such enormous loss of lives, as the structures in these countries are built with structural mitigation measures and earthquake-resistant features. This emphasizes the need for strict compliance of town planning bylaws and earthquake-resistant building codes in India. What are the earthquake mitigation measures? Well, the primary objective of earthquake-resistant design is to prevent collapse during earthquakes. Mitigation, that is, action taken to prevent or reduce the risk to life, property, social and economic activities, and natural resources from natural hazards, was the central theme of the UN International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction Initiative. Awareness, education, preparedness, and prediction and warning systems can reduce the disruptive impacts of a natural disaster on communities. Mitigation measures such as adoption of zoning, land use practices, and building codes are needed. However, to prevent or reduce actual damage from hazards. Avoiding development in landslide and flood prone areas through planning and zoning ordinances, for example, may save money in construction and reduce the loss of life and damage to property and natural resources. Post-disaster studies continue to confirm the fundamental fact that community investment in mitigation pays direct dividends when a disaster occurs. Engineered structures should be designed and built to withstand ground shaking. Soil type must be analyzed and structures must not be built on soft soil, as even a low magnitude earthquake will damage structures on soft soil. Taller buildings tend to shake longer than short buildings, making them relatively more susceptible to damage. Buildings should have a simple rectangular plan, and large buildings should be separated into rectangular blocks by providing gaps in between. Even structurally sound buildings may collapse due to inadequate foundation designs. For integrating the walls of an enclosure to perform together like a rigid box, reinforced concrete bands are provided to run continually on all external and internal walls, including partition walls. Despite increasing vulnerability to natural disasters, many communities resist adopting mitigation programs. The barriers are economic, social, and political, and mitigation is often perceived as restrictive, costly, and incompatible with the community's economic development goals. Mitigation may involve solutions that are technically sound but politically unpopular. In this context, elected officials are often reluctant to pursue mitigation programs vigorously. Although the Bureau of Indian Standards has laid down the standards for construction in the seismic zones, these are not being followed. The building construction in urban and suburban areas is regulated by the Town and Country Planning Acts and building regulations. In many cases, the building regulations do not incorporate the BIS codes. Even where they do, the lack of knowledge regarding seismically safe construction among the architects and engineers, as well as lack of awareness regarding their vulnerability among the population, led to most of the construction in the urban and suburban areas being without reference to BIS standards. In the rural areas, the bulk of the housing is non-engineered construction. The mode of construction in the rural areas has also changed from mud and thatch to brick and concrete construction, thereby increasing the vulnerability. The increasing population has led to settlements in vulnerable areas close to the riverbed areas, which are prone to liquefaction. Progress toward adoption of mitigation practices will require community commitment. recognition of constraints and barriers, and innovative solutions. Flood-proof areas, for example, could be incorporated into community enhancing open space, wildlife, and recreation attractions, or hiking and physical fitness trails. New awareness and education programs need to be developed to foster incorporation of the lessons learned from disasters. Mitigation initiatives, above all, need to involve the key groups that participate in developing, adopting, implementing, and enforcing mitigation. Public officials, finance and insurance specialists, engineers, planners and architects, civic groups, marketing specialists, educators, and researchers. The Government of India had constituted a national core group for earthquake risk mitigation in July 2003, consisting of experts in earthquake engineering and administrators. It was assigned with the responsibility of drawing up a strategy and plan of action for mitigating the impact of earthquakes, providing advice and guidance to the states on various aspects of earthquake mitigation, developing handbooks, pamphlets, and designs for earthquake resistant construction, working out systems for assisting the states in the seismically vulnerable zones to adopt and integrate appropriate Bureau of Indian Standards codes in their building bylaws, involving systems for training of municipal engineers, as also practicing architects and engineers in the private sector in the salient features of the BIS codes and the amended bylaws, evolving a system of certification of architects and engineers for testing their knowledge of earthquake resistant construction, evolving systems for training of masons, and finally, to carry out intensive awareness generation campaigns. Can earthquakes be predicted? More than 200,000 earthquakes are recorded each year, though it is estimated that several million occur globally. Earthquake prediction is a branch of the science of seismology concerned with the specification of the time, location, and magnitude of future earthquakes within stated limits, and particularly the determination of parameters for the next strong earthquake to occur in a region. Earthquake forecasting and prediction is thus an active topic of geological research. Geoscientists are able to identify particular areas of risk, and if there is sufficient information to make probabilistic forecasts about the likelihood of earthquakes happening in a specified areas over a specified period. These forecasts are based on data gathered through global seismic monitoring networks, high density local monitoring in known risk areas, and geological fieldwork, as well as from historical records. Forecasts are improved as a theoretical understanding of earthquakes grows, and geological models are tested against observation. Long-term forecasts, years to decades, are currently much more reliable than short to medium-term forecasts, that is days to months. Many methods have been developed for predicting the time and place in which earthquakes will occur. Despite considerable research efforts by seismologists, scientifically reproducible predictions cannot yet be made to a specific day or month. However, for well understood faults, the probability that a segment may rupture during the next few decades can be estimated. Earthquake warning systems have been developed that can provide regional notification of an earthquake in progress, but before the ground surface has begun to move, potentially allowing people within the system's range to seek shelter before the earthquake impact is felt. It is not currently possible to make deterministic predictions of when and where earthquakes will happen. Most geoscientists do not believe that there is a realistic prospect of accurate prediction in the foreseeable future, and the principal focus of research is on improving the forecasting of earthquakes. Let's move on to preparedness. The basic theme behind preparedness is to be ready for an earthquake. Preparedness starts with an individual's everyday life and involves items and training that would be useful in an earthquake. Preparedness continues from individual preparedness through family preparedness, community preparedness, and then business, non-profit, and governmental preparedness. Preparedness can also encompass psychological preparedness. That is, resources are designed to support both community members affected by a disaster and the disaster workers serving them. The objective of earthquake engineering is to foresee the impact of earthquakes on buildings and other structures and to design such structures to minimize the risk of damage. Falling buildings are by far the greatest cause of casualties during earthquakes, so it is essential that new buildings are constructed to withstand their effects. Existing buildings can be retrofitted to withstand earthquakes, but this is much more expensive than doing so at the time of construction. It is also essential that the local population are aware of the risks and know how to act during an earthquake. This can be a particular challenge in areas which are not frequently seismically active, where there may be no memory of large earthquakes. Earthquake insurance can provide building owners with financial protection against losses resulting from earthquakes. Levels of preparedness generally remain low despite attempts to increase public awareness. Various methods exist to promote disaster preparedness, but they are rarely well documented and their efficacy is rarely tested. Hands-on training, drills, and face-to-face interactions have proven more successful at changing behavior. Digital methods have also been used, including use of educational video games. Well, that's all from me in this video. In the next video, we shall talk about the National Disaster Management Guidelines on Earthquakes, issued by the government in April 2007. This video is based on the information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject. Do like this video and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And if you wish to drop in a line, you can always get me at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. Till later then, cheerio.